Geoffrey Huggins, who was the Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia, who tried to visit the idea of making Northern and Southern Rhodesia amalgamated with Nisana land. An optimistic man who was often known for attempting to buck the trends of organic solidarity. Elation at the prospect was short-lived, however. It was soon realised that because Northern Rhodesia and Nisana land were protectorates and governed by Whitehall, they were not aligned with Southern Rhodesia's political structure. A trend which seemed to have actually progressed over the last 100 years or so. The point being, of course, again, the duly elected white representatives of Southern Rhodesia were loath to relinquish their authority. Another trend which seemed to have lasted decades of imperialism, compounded with the strife of wars within and without the interior, had solidified mechanical solidarity into a harsh realisation of organic solidarity that was not set in stone. Mechanical solidarity being a structure oriented around human tendencies, and organic solidarity a manufactured thought process through man's need to build around his environment. A concept originated by Karl Durkheim in 1893 and reiterated in the translation of his work again in 1933. He stated, "The question is that of a connection between the individual personality and the social solidarity, and how it does the individual, whilst becoming more autonomous, depends ever more closely upon society." The Rhodesian Authority increasingly felt a considerable amount of autonomy, as they do today. While Whitehall in England continued to disagree, in his speech to the Central African Federation, Huggins is known to have said boomingly, "The whole thing will be public property, so that there will be no opportunities for debating it, not only in Central Africa, but in this country, and not only in the House, but the press and elsewhere." Again, it's like this scene keeps reoccurring. It's more sort of like saying one thing and doing this is a new thing. We think this is a new thing. Saying one thing, the Liberal Party saying one thing and doing the complete opposite. It's not. We have today a situation whereby too many on either side of the debate surrounding equality culture create a debate backed up by too little. The sort of approach is often propounded from the next turn events and the quest for Rhodesian and African equality and independence. Their new modern country after 1950 became a different type of battleground for mechanical solidarity to replace organic solidarity imposed by colonial imperialism. South Africa's borders became amassed with protesters, enraged Rhodesians desperately trying to escape what they perceived as a violation of Western promises, which they could be right about. Well, they were right about. In contrast, the apartheid cause in South Africa was resulting in millions of residents to flock the other way. Perhaps a case of the grass is always green. It certainly is looked upon over here as green, I can tell you. I get all of that also. Anyway, that's divulging into a completely different conversation. The point is the grass was always looked upon as greener. Or as Du Bois might have said, a slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. That was E.B.L. Du Bois, being a prominent African sociologist in early the 20th century. He worked hard to ease the dynamics of racial politics at the time, and by 1953 he had an effect on its outcome. The outcome resulted in the Federation of Rhodesia and Nisana forming on the 1st of August 1953. This was set up by the governor of Northern Rhodesia, Roy Welensky, and the president of Southern Rhodesia, again, Geoffrey Huggins. He finally got what he wanted back in the day, and began to consolidate the goods, so to speak. The striking opposition from within the Central African Federation and the United Federal Party only fueled Ron Walensky's petulance at the time when he said that there should be equal rights for all civilized men. However, it might be noted that his equal rights could, from the perspective of someone who knew the man, be construed as only including those of white middle-class hierarchy in Federation. What do you get? What do you get? What do you get? Oh my god. A pessimistic viewpoint, but probably true at the time. Now, sociologist Eve Franklin Fraser made a pertinent statement. When the lunatic met with the ideas incomparable with the delusion that he distorts facts by rationalization to preserve the inner consistency of his delusions. That sounds rather appropriate, cried Unspear. Although not 5 years after Fraser had uttered these words, in 1960, events in the surrounding African nations had taken their toll. The Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s had worsened matters, forcing Western powers to clamp down further, despite the UFP. All this palaver culminated in the uprising in the Congo, which was only Belgium's free state. It was literally the only Belgian free state. We throw our hands up in uproar today when people buy toilet roll upon learning of the medical crisis in Britain. It was like a few years ago. It's just calming down now. Although that pales in comparison when we consider the Belgian torrent of African nationals that flooded into Rhodesia. Now, these European authorities couldn't handle the situation and gave control eventually to the United Nations. And this only worsened matters from the other powers, as it reflected badly on the supposed Brussels bigwigs. It was felt that concern should be expressed in British Parliament, so the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan at the time, again, another story entirely, visited South Africa in February 1960. On his way through, he gave an address to the people of the UFP. The winds of change are blowing through this continent, whether we like it or not. This growth of national consciousness is a political fact. Now, on the bright side, it might be prudent to remember that what a great man said once is, always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. Well, Oscar Wilde's character in this case was an upper middle class Englishman, so the citation might not be entirely appropriate. However, the point does still stand. Despite having had a Declaration of Rights of Franchise in 1961, independence through a party leader of the Rhodesian Front in 1962 did not go off. It just didn't happen. Restless again reared its ugly head, and the people were not a happy bunch. And I'm not entirely surprised. Because of this, the colony of South Rhodesia were on the very verge of extricating themselves from the Federation back in 1953. In a strange twist of irony, it was a schoolteacher in 1964 who opposed the National Demographic Party's ruling. Working as secretary for the very institution he was complaining about was one Robert Mugabe. He said, in opposing the National Democratic Party, we could not be party to the franchise as it stands. Now, this leaves the issue of franchise as the greatest field of political operation. They wanted the Federation to prove its intent for independence. The fracturing from these circumstances still exists today. We may never know when or if it will end. The United States still suffers from its horizontal fragmentation of inequality through the ripples of civil war. Britain does not do the same thing though. The resentment it has fostered in the wake of past transitions is not quite as much. However, it is postulated in some quarters that perhaps we were born with a full range of capacities, each of which is activated and developed depending on the social cultural circumstances that govern our life. Now, this is very much, according to external, I would say, it sounds like external validity to me, very pertinent. Although this is what we find in the media and the literary narrative, and it all creates different formats. Some lend themselves to race interrogation and others do not. Tyler Perry, streaming services like Netflix and Showmax, sporting events, inclusion in horror and drama films and shows, as well as the recognition in literary mediums, as for a sporting example, massive accusations of of sparkling racist uproar was unabating during the World Cup back in 2020, instigating a backlash frenzy that lasted for weeks. I mean, weeks. It got tiring after that. But on the other side of the ban, we celebrate when a Nigerian striker joins the Swedish team the following year. What might be advisable to consider is that there is a degree of Stockholm syndrome here. A humanistic, mechanical identity goes out the window. In this postmodern age, the oppressed mentality becomes intermingled with the oppressor. 1997 brought out a salient comment in Judith Lewis Herman when she said, "In situations like captivity, the perpetrator becomes the most powerful person in the life of the victim, and the psychology of the victim is shaped by the actions and beliefs of the perpetrator." Though this goes a little way to nulling the detrimental effects of outrageous misfortune when the inhabitants of southern Rhodesia were insulted by the next turn of events. By 1963, the NDP had let go of southern Rhodesia and the Saarland through persistent interventions of Edgar Whitehead, president of the Saarland, and Hastings Bandan, leader of the Southern Rhodesia National Congress. And the Saarland became Malawi. Later, Northern Rhodesia would become Zambia. But civil unrest still remained. The two still insisted upon white rule continuing in Southern Rhodesia. Walls of terror and discontent reverberated around South Africa to Zambia. The people, they began to regard the split referendum as being down to Robert Mugabe. This is the decline of the guy, obviously. They celebrated him and enabled his rise to prominence because of his disgust with the NDP at the time. The NDP have now turned into the ZANU-PF party. I mean, this is the progression we find. The ZANU-PF are the ones that are enhancing militaristic rule at present. It's getting insane over there. I mean, I can tell you from experience. Anyway, look, listen, once again, we're getting off point. The point is that through no one within the continent was upset in any way when Harold Millen resigned as Prime Minister of Great Britain, and I'm not surprised. It was October of that year, and under supposed ill health, when Millen stepped down, Harold Wilson, he took over. And during 1963 to 64, the British government froze negotiations that were already unstable. As a result of this, there was a massive shift in social structure. We might even refrain from calling it a shift and look as it was a rift between southern Rhodesia, Malawi and Zambia. Wilson was recorded as having said that at Parliament in Britain, independence would only be granted under terms acceptable to all British subjects in the colony, not just those registered to vote. A precedent of intent and arrogance that speaks for itself. Now, in the years before 1953, equal rights in America that were recognized in other nations. As a consequence, it can be said that a certain amount of propaganda was rife as Americans faced Vietnam. The push for awareness seems to be never ending and sometimes violent. Martin Luther King noted, "Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. Speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted." For the next decade, each side has tried to mollify the antagonistic qualities of the other through the media and other outlets. The fight for independence still goes on, and there is a fear that resentment for the past emanating from both sides. This all boiled down to a clash in changing perspectives. Pride marches and festivals, political agencies such as the eventual recognition of Nelson Mandela. There continues to be segregated inclusion into sociologically bankrupt communities by the majority. This is all going on at the moment. I can tell you, I've recently been there. It all started here, in the midst of the 1960s. Flower power was the last thing on his mind when Nelson Mandela said, "It is not our diversity which divides us. It is not our ethnicity, nor religion, or culture that divides us. Since we have achieved our freedom, there can be only one division amongst us, between those who cherish democracy and those who do not." On the May 11th, 1965, President of Rhodesia, Ian Smith, demanded unilateral declaration of independence, a new sovereign state of Rhodesia. Though there were still protests, elation followed, marred only by a sense of discontent that continues to this day. The fight between Smith and Wilson was real, and the two recognised that aside from the USA nearly 200 years before, no unilateral cause for independence had ever been made, and white rule had never been circumvented in such a way. Now, hope was growing in that Martin Luther King's peaceful movement in America was having a positive effect on Western politics. For a short time in 1965, the future seemed shining, and the people could butter their toast in the morning, full in the knowledge that it was full fat margarine. It is over there quite frequent, but it was full fat margarine. Now, full fat margarine is something that could be cherished, to be quite honest with you. Cherished, even over here, particularly over there. They might even feel that marmalade was in order for those few short years until the 4th of April 1968. The news and reverberated across the world from Memphis, Tennessee, that prolific civil rights representatives had been assassinated outside. The outrage and grief flourished for the next 2 years or more. From a postmodernist perspective, British independence of identity depends upon the external validity surrounding positions and complex class system, whereas the African sense of independence of identity could be said to depend upon the suffering of their ancestral blood throughout the entire world. This is how it seemed to the Western world. However, having been there recently is probably not quite as accurate as that. It's more complicated than that, and definitely there is a certain amount of animosity which still even exists to this day. Not apparent on the conscious level, but on the subconscious level, you definitely feel it. I can tell you that much. Not prolifically across the board, but in certain social circumstances, particularly when you get into what they call a company over there, filled with loads upon loads of Rhodesian Zimbabweans. Literally, honestly, you are cramped in there. It's like going on Metropolitan Underground. It is literally insane, and you can feel a penetrating gaze at you all the time. And even when I went to it was like a barbecue sort of thing, it was really actually quite brilliant. Aside from the fact I was nearly accosted, I'm white. You see, that's the problem. I'm white, and that still permeates in society over there to this very day. Over 1,000 years before, this has been the other way around. Two opposing viewpoints resolving in a circle around a causal link. The death of one man who could see all the kicking off into Oribos yet again. A new development of vertical fragmentation of Afro-Western fracture. The core of ethno-social relations today is greed and self-serving capitalism.
This world is such a and when I say this world, I mean it. I don't mean in an ideal sense. I mean in every day, every little thing you do. It's such a gimme.
No, so it's a fight to survive, basically. Even between those minorities outside the theory. I was made aware of a Twitter feed the other day, made by my African family. For the resentment and hate, it pointed out the socio-political differentiation between our two cultures. This can only go to highlight the delight and elation contemporary society has in feeding guilt and aggression, British-American aggression, guilt that stems from colonial ambitions of past generations. These colonial ambitions were conceived in the past with no deliberate connection to contemporary infrastructure in place today. I have got another program after saying that line. Now, African aggression and guilt comes from a feeling of inherent oppression and loss of ancestral generations of the success that was attained thousands of years ago. The sociologist Max Weber is known to have postulated the impulse to acquisition has in itself nothing to do with capitalism. The impulse exists and has existed among the strata of society for thousands of years. He might have had a point. From many perspectives, it is all about control and not capitalism. We only have to look at the controversy between comedian Trevor Noah and social commentator Joe Rogan early in 2022 to see that the proto-capitalist paradigm shift is not entirely exclusive in the slightest to Caucasian African integration. The world has now globally shrunk due to postmodernist technology, and the corruption of us all is filtered into acceptability. This to the extent whereby we are all becoming victims of blanket disassociation effect. Now, according to the American Psychiatric Institution, there is much evidence that the so-called culture-bound progression disorders around the world are actually different manifestations of dissociative identity disorder. It is intrinsic to postmodern perception that we forget that Dutch and Belgian and French mining corporations were installed in North Africa long before British prospectors arrived. It is also forgotten by Western societies today of all the minorities is that those in our modern society are responsible for the atrocities that occurred before 1950. Too often today, guilt is determined through acceptability of fashion trends. Those of us in the Western world are encouraged today almost from birth to shoulder the responsibility of an atrocity that took place a century ago. It does nothing to heal the wounds that fragmented us so long ago. Western society powers were not the first invaders, of which you'll later see in later episodes. The Romans didn't do much good to the solidarity of an independent Mashonaland either. However, relief was boundless upon every land encumbered with the pan of segregation and exclusionism when, on the 18th of April 1980, official declaration of independence was finalized. Rhodesia finally became Zimbabwe. A new age dawned, and in this new age we sometimes find we have created a propensity to attack other with sociological weapons of agenda through propaganda. Such segregational group trying to beat each other with the same stick to achieve the same objectives. So are we really left with just one question?
Is it that we are geniuses at modern capitalism?
Or merely that you have a genius for being led?
See you later, chaps. Give us a good clicking.
Zvakanaka.